Have you ever found yourself sitting in a room, your body present, but your mind miles away? Maybe you were thinking about a conversation from yesterday, replaying every word. Or perhaps you were anxiously predicting how tomorrow might unfold, running endless scenarios through your head. We've all been there. It's as if we're caught in an invisible current, swept between memories of the past and projections of the future, while the present moment quietly slips through our fingers. Life isn't happening in those memories. It isn't unfolding in those future fantasies. It's happening right now. And yet, how often do we truly notice it? There's a quiet tragedy in how easily we abandon the one thing we actually possess, the now. We chase after things, longing for a better job, a different relationship, a new experience, convincing ourselves that happiness lies just a few steps ahead. And when we aren't chasing, we're haunted by regrets of things we cannot change. Like ghosts, our past mistakes, lost loves, and missed opportunities linger around us, draining the color from this very moment. But what if I told you that the peace you're searching for isn't somewhere out there? That it's not locked in your next achievement or hidden behind the doors of tomorrow? What if it's right here, quietly waiting in this moment you're living right now? In the ancient wisdom of Buddhism, the present moment is more than just a fleeting second on a clock. It's life itself. It's where freedom is found, where suffering is healed, where meaning takes root. The Buddha taught that all of our pain, our longing, our restlessness stems from our unwillingness to be here fully, honestly, courageously. We live distracted, lost in thought, craving what we don't have, rejecting what we do. And in that chasing and resisting, we miss the astonishing miracle that is happening right under our noses. Consider this. Right now, your lungs are breathing, your heart is beating. The air carries subtle scents you might have missed. Light is painting gentle patterns on the walls around you. There's an entire universe unfolding in this simple, ordinary instant. And yet most of us are absent for it. Why? Why is it so hard to stay present? Because the mind is a restless traveler. It fears stillness. It thrives on problems to solve, dangers to avoid, desires to pursue. The past and future offer endless playgrounds for this restless mind, places to replay old stories or script new ones. The present, however, demands vulnerability. To be here now means confronting yourself without distraction. It means meeting your loneliness, your hopes, your wounds exactly as they are. And that kind of honesty is terrifying for most. We live in a world that feeds our distraction. Notifications ping endlessly. Social media tugs us down rabbit holes of comparison and illusion. Deadlines chase us. Expectations suffocate us. Every moment is packed with noise, and in that noise, the tender voice of the present is drowned out. But once in a while, something happens that breaks through the fog. A sunset so stunning it steals your breath. A child's laugh that cuts through your heavy thoughts. A sudden brush with mortality, a diagnosis, a goodbye, a near miss that reminds you how fragile and precious this life truly is. And for a flicker of time, you are here, really here. And in that moment, you realize how rare it is to feel alive. The question is, do we have to wait for those dramatic interruptions to remember how to live? Must we be jolted by beauty or tragedy to wake up? Or can we choose, gently, courageously, to start arriving in our lives moment by moment? Mindfulness, as taught by the Buddha, isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you already are when you stop running. It's about reclaiming the pieces of yourself scattered across yesterday's regrets and tomorrow's worries, and gathering them gently into the space of now. You don't need a mountaintop retreat or hours of meditation to begin. You just need to notice. Notice the way your chest rises and falls as you breathe. Notice the texture of the cup in your hand, the warmth of sunlight on your skin, the sound of your footsteps against the floor. Start small. A single mindful breath, a single bite of food tasted without rushing, a conversation where you truly listen instead of preparing your reply. In those ordinary moments, extraordinary peace is hiding. And no, the mind won't stay put. It will wander as minds do. The practice is not about perfection, it's about returning, over and over, not with judgment but with tenderness. Every time you come back to now, you're training yourself to live rather than merely exist. There's a Zen saying, when walking, just walk. When eating, just eat. It sounds so simple, almost childlike. But buried in that simplicity is a profound truth. Our lives are made up of countless small moments. If we are absent for them, we are absent for our life. So here's a quiet invitation. As you listen to this, let your awareness settle. Feel your breath. Sense the weight of your body wherever you are. Notice the sounds around you. This is your life, not tomorrow's version or yesterday's memory. This one. And in it, you are already enough. If you can remember this, even for a few seconds a day, you'll begin to sense a different kind of aliveness. One that doesn't depend on perfect circumstances or future achievements. You'll realize that peace is not a distant destination, but a quiet friend sitting beside you, patiently waiting to be noticed. And as you start to touch this peace, something else happens. The frantic chasing softens. The old wounds begin to heal. The world feels a little less heavy, a little more tender. You'll find yourself smiling at simple things. The warmth of your coffee, the sound of rain, the familiar shape of the moon. This is not about escape. It's about arrival. And while the journey may feel unfamiliar at first, the path has always been here beneath your feet, waiting. There's a story the old monks tell of a man searching for peace, traveling to the farthest corners of the earth. Years pass. He climbs mountains, crosses deserts, seeks out holy teachers. Finally, exhausted, he stops by a quiet river to rest. In its reflection, he sees himself weathered, tired, and yet still alive. And in that ordinary moment, the peace he sought was there all along, waiting in his own breath, in the gentle ripples of water, in the sheer miracle of being. That moment is available to you, right now. And so, without waiting for permission or perfection, let's take a step closer to what it truly means to live awake. It's a curious thing, isn't it? We spend our lives chasing after what we already possess, searching for peace when peace is found in stillness, longing for clarity while tangled in the fog of endless thought. And though the present moment is always here, patiently waiting, we move past it as if it were invisible. But the Buddha saw this clearly. More than 2,500 years ago, under the shade of a bodhi tree, a young seeker named Siddhartha Gautama sat quietly, confronting the deepest truths of human existence. What he realized in those silent hours would echo across centuries, not as a religion to be blindly followed, but as a direct invitation to wake up. At the heart of his teaching is one simple, profound truth. Suffering arises when we abandon the present moment, not because life is cruel, not because the universe conspires against us, but because we cling. We cling to what has already passed, and we crave what has yet to come. In doing so, we step out of the living current of now, and in that exile we suffer. The Buddha spoke of this restlessness as dukkha, a word often translated as suffering, but it means so much more. It's the ache of dissatisfaction, the subtle tension of always wanting life to be other than it is. It's the quiet hum of unease that follows even our happiest moments, because part of us is always reaching for something else. And yet there's an escape from this cycle, not in some distant heaven, not in the accumulation of things, but in returning over and over to the simplicity of what is. The Buddha once said, "Do not dwell in the past, do not dream of the future, concentrate the mind on the present moment." Such a simple instruction, yet so easily overlooked in our distracted modern lives. Why the present? Because it's the only place where reality lives. The past is a memory. The future is imagination. But this breath, this sound, this feeling in your chest, this is truth. In one of the earliest recorded teachings, the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha laid out a precise, elegant framework for cultivating this presence of mind. He taught the practice of mindfulness, or sati in Pali, not as a trendy buzzword or a temporary stress reliever, but as the direct path to awakening. Mindfulness, as the Buddha described it, is a radical act of attention. It's the courage to witness your experience without judgment, to see your thoughts as thoughts, your emotions as passing clouds, your sensations as ripples in a vast, open field of awareness. When walking, know that you are walking. When breathing, know that you are breathing. When feeling joy or sadness or anger, recognize it for what it is, without clinging, without resisting. In doing so, you cut through the illusion that your thoughts are you, that your feelings must control you, that your circumstances define you. You begin to see that everything, every fear, every desire, every fleeting joy rises and falls like waves upon the surface of a great ocean. And beneath those waves, a stillness, a peace that has always been there. It's important to understand. Mindfulness isn't about forcing yourself to stay present every moment of the day. It's not about perfection. The Buddha knew the mind would wander, that's its nature. The practice lies in gently noticing when it does and returning again and again to now. The Buddha used a beautiful metaphor for this. He compared the mind to a candle flame flickering in the wind, constantly moving, dancing, wavering. But with patient awareness, the winds calm, and what was once scattered begins to settle. Over time, something shifts. You start to recognize the patterns of your mind, the old stories you tell yourself, the automatic reactions, the habitual fears. And in that recognition, space opens up. A space where you are no longer enslaved by your thoughts, no longer dragged by your cravings or aversions. You start to taste freedom, not a dramatic, cinematic kind of freedom, but a quiet, steady kind. The freedom to respond rather than react. The freedom to savor a moment without needing it to be different. The freedom to simply be without the restless itch to become. And in this space, something else awakens. Compassion for yourself in your beautiful imperfection, for others in their silent battles, for the world in its aching, chaotic, luminous humanity. This is what the Buddha meant by the end of suffering. Not the end of pain or loss or difficulty, for those are woven into the fabric of existence, but the end of unnecessary suffering, the end of being at war with what is. To live mindfully, to root yourself in the present moment, is not to escape life's hardships, but to meet them with clarity, with tenderness, with wisdom. And when you do, even the painful moments become teachers. Even grief holds lessons. Even loneliness reveals hidden places within your heart. There's a story told in the old monasteries of a young monk who asked his master, "Master, what is the secret of happiness?" The master replied, "Eat when you are hungry, sleep when you are tired, and when you walk, just walk." At first, it sounds laughably simple, but buried in those words is a path most of us have long forgotten. When you truly taste your food, not scrolling through your phone, not rushing to the next task, but feeling the texture, the warmth, the life it carries, you touch the sacred. When you fully rest without guilt, without racing thoughts, you honor the rhythms of your being. When you walk feeling the earth beneath your feet, the air on your skin, you remember that you belong to this world. These small moments lived fully are the building blocks of a meaningful life, and the Buddha knew it. So now, in this moment, ask yourself gently, where is my mind? Is it clinging to a story of the past? Is it chasing a fantasy of the future? Or can I, just for now, arrive here, Feel the breath. Notice the sounds around you. Sense the weight of your body. This is life, and it's beautiful exactly as it is. Let's walk a little deeper into this wisdom, not as followers of ancient words, but as travelers reclaiming the art of being truly alive. It's strange when you think about it. We live in an age of astonishing convenience. Machines wash our clothes, apps deliver meals to our doorstep. We carry the world's knowledge in a device no larger than our palm. And yet somehow, we feel more restless, more overwhelmed, and more disconnected than ever before. The irony isn't lost on us. We invented tools to save time, but now we're prisoners of our schedules. We sought entertainment to ease our burdens, but now we drown in an endless scroll of distractions. We chased comfort, and in doing so, lost touch with something essential, ourselves. And it's here, in the midst of this modern storm, that the ancient art of mindful living becomes not just relevant, but necessary. Mindfulness isn't about renouncing the world, moving to a mountaintop, or escaping modern life. It's about returning to the moment you're already in, not as a passive observer, but as an intimate participant. You see, the problem isn't technology. It isn't the city or the traffic or the deadlines. The real trouble lies in how we abandon ourselves in those moments, how we drift through life on autopilot, our bodies here, but our minds elsewhere. Consider this. How many times have you driven somewhere, arrived at your destination, and realized you remember nothing about the journey? How often do you find yourself eating a meal, barely tasting a single bite, because your thoughts were tangled in a meeting you had this morning or a conversation you might have tomorrow? We've become experts at being anywhere but here, and the cost is heavy. We lose the simple joys, the warmth of sunlight through a window, the sound of rain against glass, the brief spark of connection in a stranger's smile. We become strangers in our own lives, forever chasing the next thing, the next escape, the next hit of fleeting happiness. But it doesn't have to be this way. The art of mindful living isn't about adding something new to your busy day. It's about remembering what's already here. It begins with the simplest act, attention. When you brush your teeth, notice the coolness of the water, the texture of the bristles, the rhythm of your hand. When you drink your morning coffee, really taste it. Let the warmth fill your chest. Feel the weight of the cup in your palm. When you speak with someone, listen not just with your ears, but with your whole being. Let their words land before you race to reply. These aren't grand gestures, but they are sacred because they return you to your life. Mindfulness is not reserved for meditation cushions or retreat centers. It lives in the ordinary, in traffic jams and grocery lines, in emails and conversations, in heartbreak and laughter. And here's the thing, your mind will wander 1,000 times a day. That's not a failure, that's human. The practice lies in noticing when it does and gently bringing it back to your breath, back to this step, back to this word, this sound, this moment. Over time, something remarkable begins to happen. The world softens. You stop racing through your life and start inhabiting it. That tension in your chest you never noticed before, it loosens. The endless replay of past mistakes, it quiets. The desperate craving for some future where everything is finally perfect, it fades. And in its place, a kind of ease arises. Not because your problems vanished, but because you stopped resisting them. The Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh once said, "When you walk, arrive with every step." It sounds simple, and it is, but simple is not the same as easy. Our modern lives pull us in 1,000 directions. The hum of notifications, the pressure to perform, the silent competition of appearances, but mindfulness offers a quiet rebellion against all of it. A gentle but radical choice to be here. Now as you are, you don't have to quit your job, you don't have to move to the forest. You don't have to fix yourself before you begin. You start where you are with this breath, this sound, this heartbeat. And in doing so, you slowly reclaim the pieces of your life you've abandoned along the way. Because here's the truth no one tells you. There is no perfect moment waiting for you someday. No flawless version of you you'll magically become. There's only this life. This ordinary, extraordinary, messy, luminous life. And it's enough. The art of mindful living isn't about escaping modern life. It's about being so deeply present in it that even the mundane becomes miraculous. So that when the sun sets behind a row of city buildings, you notice the way it paints the sky in impossible colors. So that when a child laughs in a crowded cafe, you let that sound linger in your chest a little longer. So that when grief visits, you don't run, you open the door and sit with it like an old, unwelcome friend, knowing it too will pass. This is the art, not perfection, not constant calm, but presence. Raw, honest, beautiful presence. And the best part, you can begin right now, before this breath ends. There's a quiet truth in this world we so often overlook. You've been carrying a bridge with you your entire life. A bridge between your restless thoughts and your calm center. A bridge between anxiety and peace, between distraction and presence. And it's been right under your nose all along. It's your breath. Not some complicated philosophy, not a ritual in a distant temple, not a secret passed down by mystics. Just this simple, steady, unassuming breath. The Buddha called it anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing. It's one of the oldest, most profound, and most accessible practices in all of Buddhist tradition. And it requires nothing but your attention. The breath is a perfect anchor because it's always here. You don't have to invent it. You don't have to earn it. You don't even have to believe in anything. It rises, and it falls. And in between those two, there's a quiet doorway. A chance to come home to yourself. Let's be honest though. The first time you sit with your breath, it might feel impossibly dull. Your mind, used to chasing 1,000 different stories, will rebel. It will itch to check your phone. It will remind you of deadlines, old regrets, random lyrics from songs you haven't heard in years. And you'll be tempted to give up, to label this as pointless. But if you stay, if you return to the breath over and over without judgment, something subtle begins to shift. At first, you notice the breath's texture, the coolness as it enters your nostrils, the warmth as it leaves, the gentle rise and fall of your chest, like waves kissing the shore. And then, more than sensation, you start to notice space. The tiny pause at the top of an inhale. The brief stillness before an exhale begins. In those pauses, there's a silence most of us haven't felt since childhood. Not absence, but presence. And here's the beauty, you don't need to meditate for hours to find it. One mindful breath is a meditation. One honest inhale fully felt is a prayer. One exhale fully released is a letting go. You can practice it anywhere. At a red light, in a crowded elevator, before a difficult conversation, while washing dishes or waiting for your coffee to brew. This is mindfulness in its purest, most human form. Not as an escape from life, but as a way to step into it more deeply. Thich Nhat Hanh, whose gentle wisdom touched millions, often guided students with this simple mantra. Breathing in, I know I am breathing in. Breathing out, I know I am breathing out. At first glance, it seems almost childlike. But don't mistake simplicity for insignificance. Within those words lies the entire path home. Because in acknowledging this breath, you claim this moment. You cut through the noise of past and future. You remember what it means to be alive. And from there, other small miracles begin to unfold. Your heartbeat slows. Your tense shoulders soften. The tight knot in your stomach loosens. Suddenly, the thing you thought you couldn't face feels a little less impossible. The burden you carried feels a little lighter. The person in front of you seems a little more human. This is how the breath becomes a bridge. It connects mind and body. It connects you to the world around you. It turns fleeting seconds into sacred moments, and it asks for so little in return. No perfection, no elaborate rituals, just your presence. Of course, your mind will wander. That's what minds do. But each time you notice it, you get to practice returning. And every return is a victory, not because you reached some mystical state, but because you chose to come back, to this breath, to this life. And over time, those scattered, restless moments start to weave into something softer, steadier, and astonishingly alive. You begin to realize you were never as lost as you thought. You were just a few breaths away from home. And the more you practice, the more natural it becomes. Not another thing on your to-do list, but a quiet undercurrent to your day. You start greeting stress with awareness instead of reaction. You notice beauty in the ordinary. You respond to pain with gentleness instead of panic. Because when you anchor yourself in the breath, you discover what the Buddha knew centuries ago. That peace isn't something you find. It's something you remember. And you remember it one breath at a time. It happens to all of us. You sit down with good intentions. You close your eyes, you take a breath. And before you even realize it, your mind is already gone. A memory from yesterday, a worry about tomorrow, a sharp ache in your chest that has no name, 1,000 restless voices pulling you in 1,000 different directions. Distraction is not a flaw. It's part of the human condition. We live in a world built to scatter our attention. Endless notifications, breaking news, buzzing devices, and invisible expectations we didn't even agree to. And yet, in the middle of this storm, there's a deeper restlessness. Not just distraction, but a kind of emotional turmoil. An undercurrent of unease, grief, anger, or loneliness that most of us have learned to numb or outrun. The Buddha understood this long before smartphones and social media. He spoke of the 5 hindrances, ancient obstacles to mindfulness that feel shockingly familiar even now. Sensual desire, the pull toward pleasure and escape. Aversion, the knee-jerk rejection of discomfort. Restlessness and worry, the mind's endless chatter. Sloth and torpor, the heaviness that keeps us from starting. Doubt, the voice that whispers, "Why bother?" These aren't sins or moral failings. They're part of being alive. But if left unchecked, they become the very walls that separate us from peace. The first step isn't to fight them, it's to notice them. You might sit in meditation and feel an itch to check your phone. Notice it. You might remember an old hurt and feel a wave of anger rise. Notice it. You might feel a crushing weight of sadness you can't explain. Notice it. This is not about suppression or denial. It's about making space. Space for what's real. Because here's the secret, whatever you resist persists, and whatever you gently allow begins to soften. When anger arises, name it softly. Ah, anger is here. When fear tightens your chest, meet it like an old friend. Hello, fear. When boredom numbs you, greet it with curiosity. So this is boredom. You don't have to fix it. You don't have to analyze its origin, just witness it. This witnessing in Buddhism is called bare attention, a clean, non-judging awareness. Noticing the storm without getting swept away by it. Imagine you're sitting by a river. Leaves float by on the water, some bright, some dark, some heavy, some light. Each thought, each emotion is a leaf. You don't grab them. You don't chase them. You simply watch them pass. At first, your mind will protest. It spent years mastering the art of distraction after all. But slowly, with kindness, you train yourself to stay. And in this staying, something remarkable happens. You realize you are not your thoughts. You are not your emotions. You are not the restless, anxious voice inside your head. You are the awareness behind them, the stillness watching the storm. This realization doesn't erase pain or difficulty. It changes your relationship with them. When anxiety shows up, it's no longer a tyrant. It's a visitor. When grief arrives, it's no longer a bottomless pit. It's a wave you can ride. And every time you return to your breath, every time you anchor yourself in the present, those storms begin to lose their power. Not because the world gets quieter, but because you've grown steadier. This is the heart of the practice. Not chasing calm or perfection, but meeting each moment messy, beautiful, unbearable, sacred, exactly as it is. And in doing so, you uncover an ancient wisdom. That peace isn't the absence of chaos. It's the ability to be fully here even in the middle of it. You'll still get distracted. You'll still lose your way. But every time you notice, you get to return. And that return, however small, is the practice. That return is freedom. So take a breath now. Feel it rise and fall. Notice whatever's stirring inside you. And know that you are already enough, already whole, already home. What if meditation wasn't something you did for 10 minutes in the morning? What if it wasn't confined to a cushion, a quiet room, or a specific posture? What if your entire life was the meditation? This isn't a new idea. It's ancient. It's how the great teachers lived. The Buddha didn't teach mindfulness as an isolated ritual. He taught it as a way of walking through the world. A way of meeting each moment, each person, each task, not as an obstacle to mindfulness, but as its very ground. Modern life loves to compartmentalize. Work here. Relaxation there, spirituality in a neat little box for weekends or special retreats. But the real path begins when you blur those lines. Consider something as ordinary as washing your hands. The water runs warm. The soap slips between your fingers. Bubbles catch the light. For a few seconds, your entire attention rests in this simple sensory act. No past, no future. Just water and skin. Or imagine listening to a friend, not half listening while your mind drafts a reply or glances at your phone or replays some old conversation, but truly listening, hearing the texture of their voice, noticing the flicker in their eyes, sensing the space between their words. In these moments, life stops rushing by unnoticed. You inhabit it fully. This is what Zen calls every moment practice. The idea that the sacred hides inside the mundane. That enlightenment isn't found in some distant mountain temple, but in the way you tie your shoes, drink your tea, or wait for a red light to turn green. You don't need special incense or ancient chants. You need presence. And presence begins wherever you are. Take eating, for example. Most of us eat distracted, scrolling through phones, lost in thought, rushing through a meal we barely taste. But what if a simple bowl of rice became a meditation? Feeling the texture of each grain, noticing the scent, chewing slowly not from duty but from curiosity, appreciating the hands that planted, harvested, cooked, and served this food. In that attention, you touch gratitude. And gratitude transforms even the plainest meal into a sacred offering. The same holds true for walking. We rush from task to task, our feet moving, our minds somewhere else. But mindful walking asks something different. Feel each step. Notice the contact of your soul with the ground. Feel the shift of weight, the subtle balance of your body. Even a short walk to the mailbox becomes a small pilgrimage. These small, intentional moments, washing a cup, folding laundry, brushing your teeth, become threads of meditation woven through your day. And over time, these threads form a tapestry. A life no longer divided between sacred and secular, but wholly alive, wholly awake. It doesn't mean you'll never feel irritated or stressed or lost. It means that even those states become part of the practice. When anger flares, notice it. When boredom visits, invite it in. When joy arrives unexpectedly, savor it. The world won't stop throwing challenges your way, but you'll stop being swept away by them, and something remarkable happens. The ordinary begins to shine. You'll realize that what you were chasing, peace, meaning, belonging, was never somewhere else. It was here, hidden in plain sight. A cup of tea, a rain-soaked window, the sound of your own steady breath. Each one a doorway, each one a reminder this moment is your life, and it is enough. So as you move through today, let yourself return, not to some perfect state, but to this imperfect, tender, fleeting now. Let your life become your meditation, not something extra to add, but the very way you move through this world. Because in the end, enlightenment isn't a destination, it's a way of seeing. And the world is offering itself to you, right now, in 1,000 humble, beautiful ways. You only have to notice. Some journeys don't end. They circle back quietly, leading you to where you began, but with new eyes. By now, you've seen it. The invisible weight of our distracted lives. The way we chase after moments we miss while they're happening. The ancient wisdom that has whispered through centuries. Now is enough. You've explored the art of mindful living, felt the gentle pull of your own breath as an anchor, discovered how even the simplest tasks can open a doorway to something vast and tender. And here you are, at the threshold of a new beginning, not a grand, dramatic transformation, no lightning bolt, no echoing chant from mountaintops, just this moment, this breath, this life. And it's yours to claim, so pause for a second. Notice the air against your skin, the quiet hum of life around you, the rise and fall of your chest. You don't need to fix yourself to be worthy of this moment. You don't have to wait for a perfect morning, a calmer schedule, or a softer heart. You begin exactly as you are, and you commit, not once but again and again. Each sunrise an invitation, each setback a lesson, each mundane task a chance to return. This isn't about perfection, it's about presence. About catching yourself mid-worry and choosing to breathe. About tasting your food before your mind races to tomorrow's problems. About listening, truly listening, to a friend's voice as though it were a sacred bell. Life will still surprise you, storms will come, doubts will creep in. But now you'll know a secret: every breath is a fresh start. Every moment holds the chance to wake up. You are never too lost, never too late. And if you forget, if you wander, if you fall back into the blur, remember this: presence is always waiting, right here, right now. And before we part ways for now, if this journey spoke to something quiet inside you, if these words helped you slow down, reflect, or see your world with gentler eyes, I'd love for you to stay connected. Subscribe to this channel and let's walk this path together. Drop a comment and share your favorite mindful moment from today. Or tell me where you'd like this journey to lead next. Because this space isn't mine alone, it belongs to every one of us choosing to live awake. Thank you for being here. Thank you for showing up for your life. And until we meet again, breathe deep, be kind to yourself. And remember, this moment is your home, and it's beautiful.